I'm going to talk for a second, and then I'm going to kind of hand over to Lucy for more local context. And I first want to thank Jared and the team for getting me up here, and Lucy as well, so that we could join this really important conversation for the Territory. And also I want to thank Walter and Di for your opening comments from your perspective. That was just fabulous to listen to both of you. And yes, I'm definitely going to talk some supply chain stuff, Di, so we're safe here. I like to start by talking about where I come from. I come from unceded Dja country in the Central Highlands of Victoria. And a Dja woman, Beck Phillips, told us once when she came to the farm that if you are 60% water, human bodies are 60% water, then you're 60% the Loddon River in her case. And I thought, well, I don't drink river water, I drink rainwater. So does that mean make me 60% sky? And I was like, oh no, that's not actually what it makes you. Rain comes from the sky, but it's seeded from the land. And our rain comes primarily from Ngarrindjeri country over here in South Australia, and some from Gunditjmara country. So what's interesting on our farm is that we also share our land with First and Second Nations market gardeners, and Josh, who is Ngarrindjeri, is one of them. And so the land from his ancestral country is nourishing us, and they have a responsibility to send it to us clean. What's even more interesting is that in the water cycle, we send it back to them. We recharge their water. So we have a reciprocal responsibility to send it back clean. And so when we think about that we're 60% water, we always think about where's it coming from, what responsibility do others have to us, and what responsibility do we have back to them. And I think about that about every kind of bit of food that we eat as well. You know, if you're eating McDonald's, does that make you like 50% McDonald's? You know, I don't know what it makes you, but it's probably not very healthy. If you're in America, it's actually probably Australian beef, as it turns out. We'll talk about that too. I've got the thing. Okay. I like to remind myself what my niche in the ecosystem is, what all of our human niche in the ecosystem is, like Tyson Yunkaporta tells us, which is to look after the land and the sky and everything in between. We don't think as humans that we're exceptional in our role. We just think that like every other species in the ecosystem, we have a niche role to play, and ours is to be really good custodians. So that's, I think Di has expressed that so well on your farm over in WA, and we're the same where we are. Another thing I like to remind myself of at the start of any of these kind of talks is that we're the minority world. People like to say, how are we going to feed the world? How are we going to feed the 10 to 12 billion people that are projected to be on the planet, you know, in another 30 years or whatever it is? We have enough to feed 10 billion people on the planet already, as it turns out, even though we're only about 8 billion. But we are terrible at fair distribution of food. We don't have a production problem. We have a governance and distribution problem. We've been increasing production like maniacs. When I say we, I mean like those people that actually Walter was talking about. A lot of that increase is coming from people who don't want to feed us food at all. They want to feed us ultra-processed foods, which are not food. It's the food-like substances that Walter talked about. So we have enough food. We don't need to produce more food, and that's a furphy, as they say in Australia. Our part of the world, the so-called global north, or the minority world, is only 20% of the world's population. The global south, which is the majority world, is 80% of the world's population. Our 20% is using 80% of the world's resources. We're using way more than our share. And when I say we, it is actually you and I in this room, even if we're very careful about our composting and minimizing our consumption, we're still using more than they are in the global south. We're using more petrol to drive places, we're buying more clothes, we are using more. But the bulk of it is still not us. It is the multinationals who are doing a lot more resource use than you and I in this room. Every bit of composting that you do is not going to change that until we change a few other things. The next thing will remind us who actually feeds the world anyway. So is it a problem that Australia does or doesn't feed the world? Not really, because globally, 70% of the world's food is produced by smallholders. And unlike Di and Ian over in WA, I'm very much a smallholder. I'll talk in a minute about our farm, but we're only on 28.5 hectares. Oh, sorry, yeah, hectares. So 69 acres. We're on a very, very small property that supports 7 livelihoods. There's family and non-family members farming there, and all 7 of us are supported on that tiny little acreage. So that's actually the norm. I think Walter said, you know, in Australia, the average land size is 4,331 hectares is the ABS figure. That's not normal. Most of the world's food is produced on less than 2 hectares. That's actually, China and India are more than half the world's population, and their average landholding for where they're producing most of their food is under 2 hectares. That's normal, not us. So what do we produce? I mean, we mostly know we're a huge exporting country. We do export quite a lot of beef and lamb, and that at least does go into, depending on the country it goes to, it mostly goes to real food, but it is mostly feeding middle-class societies in middle-class countries. It's not feeding the hungry. In the case of the US, I think I said it before, 80% of the beef that goes to the US, Liberation Day taught us a bit about this, is going into McDonald's, Carl's Jr., and Burger King. It's cold cows going into hamburger meat. So it becomes an ultra-processed food anyway, even though it was actually meat that could have been quite nutritious had it not been transformed into fast food. In the case of these others, sugar, canola, wheat, those are, as Dja said, they're either livestock feed, they're biofuels, or they're ingredients for what become ultra-processed food. Most of that is not feeding people real food. It's making people quite sick. So back to the microbiome, oil palm plantations, you all know, are kind of this devastating thing for ecosystems across Southeast Asia and other parts of the world that then make devastating things for human biomes in ultra-processed foods. But so is wheat and canola and sugar. They're all going into the same kind of products. In Australia, 50% of the average Australian's diet is now UPFs. It's making us pretty sick. I'm going to get to who's doing that because I'm practicing recently not saying we when I mean they. And a comrade of mine in Indonesia, Zainal, he actually talks about our enemies. We have to know who our enemies are. And I found that word really weird when I first heard it. But I'm like, actually, you know what? It's kind of fair. There are a lot of enemies in this group. This is a photo of somebody else's slide. Yes, that's kind of plagiarism, I know. Her name is Jennifer Clapp. I heard her speak at a meeting in Kuala Lumpur last week. And I just thought, it's just a really good picture, and I'm going to just grab it. So I'll let Jennifer know. But yeah, it is a photo of somebody else's slide. Yeah, so 4 firms control 50 to 60%. You can see it all there. Like the concentration of ownership. The meetings I was at in KL last week were actually about powerful private and corporate actors in the food system. And the number of them is shrinking. Like there's so few of them. In fact, it's getting to so few, I'm starting to think, does that mean it's going to be easier to take them out? Because there aren't that many of them left? I don't know, hold that thought. In Australia, we actually, we have the concentration of the retail, the grocery sector. We have the most concentrated retail grocery sector in the world. So in Canada, they think it's upsetting that 5 grocery stores control 80% of their market. I'm like, try 2. See what you think when you get to 2. Oh no, Aldi gets us to the 80%. Aldi's the 4th biggest grocer in the world, like retail grocer in the world. These are not small companies controlling the system. Now I want to talk about abattoirs. Anyone who knows me knows I've been very disciplined not talking about them for all this time until now. I've held my tongue. So this is specifically in Australia. There are 4 companies that now control nearly 50% of meat processing or slaughter in Australia. JBS is the biggest. They control 25% of slaughter in this country. They're, as you would know, they're a global meat packing giant. They're the world's biggest meat packer. With egregious human rights offenses. They spent time in jail. The Batista brothers spent time in jail because they bribed 1,900, I think it was, politicians in Brazil. I think they got 3 months for it, and they still profited while they were in jail. And then there's Thomas Foods International, which is actually an Australian company, and then there's Tees, which made a joint venture with Cargill, also one of the world's biggest food companies, and then the Midfield Group. But you can see how quickly it drops. So the others, although they're holding a fair share, it gets much smaller very quickly. This isn't good for any of us who want to sell direct to market. I actually, on the drive here from, it's about an 8-hour, if I didn't stop, it would be about 8 hours driving. I had to go to Wangaratta to drop off 2 steers at the abattoir in Wangaratta because Hardwicks in Kyneton, which is only 40 minutes from us, kicked us all out in December. That was the sixth abattoir in WA, Victoria, and New South Wales to stop service kills for smallholders or close in 5 months. So we managed to get enough killed to make us to the end, get us to the end of March, and then somebody in our meat collective actually gave us some of their beef to get us through April, but you'll hear in a minute about our micro-abattoir. We're not done yet. So I had to get 2 animals to Wangaratta, which is a 3.5-hour drive. We've never taken our animals that far, and I know many farmers have to. They don't have any choice. But driving in them that far, I actually found really upsetting. Like feeling their movement in the trailer for 3.5 hours instead of 40 minutes. I thought, this is no good for these animals. And if I'd had to turn around and go home, that's an 8-hour day for me just to drop them off. Instead, I left the trailer, came up here to talk to all of you, and I'll pick up the trailer on the way home. So what's the alternative? What's what we're here to talk about at this event, right? The alternatives are bountiful, but they're like a lot of work, I can tell you, because we're doing it. So on our farm, on that tiny little acreage, we have us and Tampinyeri growers, the First Nation market gardeners. We've had a boning room, a butcher shop for 11 years on the farm, which is just a shipping container, 40-foot shipping container that's been a licensed facility since 2014. And then now we're building the micro-abattoir, which is a little photo of in a minute. Talking about compost, actually, Walter and Dja were both like this. That's Audrey up the top right. She's a rotating composting drum. So she was built in anticipation of the abattoir so that we could cycle those nutrients on the farm. We're net fertility producers, obviously, as livestock farmers, and Tampinyeri are net fertility consumers. And so as everybody from when Jared first opened today has said, we need to bring livestock and plant growing back together, and that heals what somebody called the metabolic rift. We have the whole industrial system has caused a metabolic rift, and we need to heal that. Audrey is the stomach of the farm, and that's her job. Somebody shared this this comic up in KL as well, and I thought, oof, you know, it's pointed, isn't it? The now what? And then I can tell you, because we're part of a global movement, right down to local movements, that we know what's next because we're doing it, because peasants all over the world are still doing it, including here in Australia. We are building the now what, because across the world, they never completely disappeared. You know, the global movement for peasants, La Via Campesina, is 300 million strong of signed up members of organizations that are member of La Via Campesina, including the Food Sovereignty Alliance. So it's the largest transnational social movement in the world. We're not insignificant at all. We know what's next because we're already doing it. I just put these principles up. I'm not going to go through them, but it's worth taking a photo or looking up the paper, Geraldo and Rossett 2022, because the principles we follow to solve the problems of the old system mean we can't replicate them. We can't just build a smaller version of a shit system. So we're trying not to extract surplus value from any part of the system. We want everyone to be paid fairly and every bit, whether it's the soil or the plants or the animals or the workers or the people who are going to be able to afford the food. Everybody gets a fair share in this system. That's why it's emancipatory. Have you all got photos? I'm not going to cut anybody off. Good. So I'm going to finish and hand it to Lucy in just a sec. This is our abattoir. So yesterday, as I drove up here, Stuart and the team from Tampinyeri and a couple of the farmers in our meat collective, there are about 15 farms that the abattoir is going to be able to service. And it's a tiny facility. So that's a 5 by 5 meter by 5 meters high for the height for the cattle, because the regulations require you to kill inside. So we have to have that facility. It's mostly chillers in the 40-foot container. But that's the whole facility. There's nothing more than what you see here. Yesterday, they laid the last slabs for the knockbox and the forcing pen and the race, which is all Temple Grandin's designs. We've built it all entirely ourselves. We're doing it with the smell of an oily rag. We've been doing fundraising instead of loans. But if you stay down at like that kind of under $200,000 mark, you can do that. You can raise that kind of money, especially if you have a husband like mine who can build this. Not everyone can do that. And it's not just for us, I think, is the other important point. We're not vertically integrating just ourselves, but not every farm needs to build their own abattoir. So there, like I said, there are about 15 farmers involved in the collective. And it's an incorporated association. So that's the governance model, is all the farmers get to democratically determine what happens with the abattoir. and they get to help set the pricing. They get to help decide what packaging we use. We won't use any chemicals because it all has to go to Audrey. She'll process any solid waste and the liquid wash down as well. So you can't use any bad chemicals. It's built into the system. You need to maintain the biology. And I'm not playing a video, even though it looks like I'm about to. This is just to show that in collectivizing and organizing and acting, we've had a massive national campaign going about the loss of abattoirs in this country, and we'd welcome everyone to join the Food Sovereignty Alliance and help with the work that we're doing. But we managed to get some major publicity. I was on the Today show, Liberation Day. I was the farmer who responded to his live announcements, because I'm like an expert on beef exports. That's not necessarily true. But I did manage to turn Liberation Day conversations to our advantage and say, yeah, free trade sucks, doesn't it? You know, so it was a very different conversation than I think the Today show expected at 7:10 a.m. And now I'm going to hand it to Lucy, who with Southern Harvest, which is a member of the Food Sovereignty Alliance, shows how we need this kind of collective work from everything from the ground up of the farmers to their organizations, to the national organizations, to the global organizations, so we can all learn from each other and actually rebuild this system for everyone. Lucy.
I'm going. I'm working. All right. Well, Tammy's going to stay right there because we're going to keep talking to each other. This is a conversation, you know. So we've heard a little bit today about food security, people having enough food. How many people are familiar with the term food sovereignty? Okay, that is some of you, but not all of you. So food sovereignty, and I've written down the definition here, asserts the right of peoples to nourishing and culturally appropriate food produced and distributed in ecologically sound and ethical ways, and their right to collectively determine their own food and agriculture systems. So a lot of what we've heard this morning and a lot of what we've spoken about is how do we retain soil integrity on farm? How do we improve the environment and the microbiome of things happening on farm? If all of our efforts and all of our collective power goes to what's happening on farm and finishes at the fence line, then there's not much that we can do about the system that we're a part of. So as Diane was saying, you know, a lot of her wheat is still going into the commodity market because there aren't necessarily those direct market models available. And so when we want to start talking about how do farmers directly sell their produce to consumers, and how do you tell the story of what you're doing on your farm? How do you tell the story of our land is healthier, our animals are healthier, our soil is healthier, you know, and the whole environment is healthier? How can you do that if everything you're producing goes to the commodity market, ends up in a hamburger in McDonald's in the States? And while that might sound like a kind of pie-in-the-sky scenario or a burger-in-the-sky scenario, there are farmers in the Canberra region who are farming regeneratively, who are moving cattle around their pasture, who are regenerating the landscape, and then they put their cattle on a truck and off it goes. It goes to the sale yards in Yass, or it goes to the export abattoir in Goulburn, and off it goes to become a burger in the States, or a steak in Singapore, or a burger here. But those farmers don't necessarily ever have the opportunity to directly sell their produce to the consumer who actually really wants food that's been produced well and produced in an ethically sound way. And so a lot of the work that the Food Sovereignty Alliance does, so that's Tammi and I are a part of, and the work that Southern Harvest Co-operative does, who I work with Ruth, and we work in the ACT region, is providing that infrastructure. Not a middleman, because as we know, middlemen are a scourge on our earth, as Wendell Berry says, and are there to scoop up profits. That's the supermarkets, right? That's those multi-million-dollar organisations that Tammi showed before, like JBS, but a conduit to provide the infrastructure for farmers to be able to value add their products, take their products directly to market, and actually take it to the consumers. And at the end of the day, get a better deal for themselves. We know that supermarkets have been steadily devaluing food by taking the profits for themselves, devaluing what the farmer gets. I think probably everyone in this room is aware of what happened to the dairy industry. You know, we used to have thousands and thousands of very small family-run dairy farms They were deregulated, they were consolidated into massive processing plants that were owned by the supermarkets. Then the supermarkets decided that they were going to have a little battle about how cheap they could make milk, which put a lot of people out of business. And as a result, we have far fewer dairy farms in Australia now than we used to. And that's just one example of one industry, but we're seeing it replicated over and over. So Tammy's obviously really passionate about abattoirs, being a small-scale livestock farmer. Abattoirs are an issue for us in this region as well. So we've seen recently the Cowra abattoir has stopped taking service kills. We've seen the Canberra abattoir has closed down as well. We've seen a lot of different small-scale abattoirs.
Do you want me to read the list?
Yeah,
I wrote
the
it
list.
out.
Tammy's got the whole list.
I've got the list. So Goulburn is Southern Meats, which is owned by WA Meats, actually. No service kills. Wagga is Tees, which is the Tees family, and Cargill, no service kills. Mon Beef down in Cooma, no service kills. Cootamundra is Australian Meat Group, no service kills. Juni, Gundagai, and Cowra are all vertically integrated, and Cowra recently stopped their service kills. Bega closed in 2016, that was the cooperative poultry. Milton closed in 2020, Maruya closed in 2023, Canowindra just closed in 2024, and now I think all that's left, and Suze or others in the room can correct me, but I think it's just Picton and then Blue Ribbon and a couple of other poultry ones in Sydney. I think that's all you have for service kills coming from this region now. You have to drive to Sydney to kill animals.
Yeah.
That's weird.
And it's, it's not just abattoirs, it's not just dairy, but also for a lot of the horticulture that happens in our region. If you think about cherries from young, that's one of the sort of beautiful things that people look forward to in springtime, cherries from young. A lot of those cherries that are then sold in Canberra go from young to Sydney back down to Canberra instead of coming straight here. And so we're just seeing this increase in the amount of distance that food has to travel. That means that the cherries that we get in Canberra are way less fresh, way less delicious than if they were coming straight here. And so we're able to get some stuff directly from farmers through farmers markets. So I know the Canberra Capital Region Farmers Markets crew are here today. We've got Goulburn Farmers Markets, did you say? And Southern Harvest also runs the Bungendore Farmers Market. So farmers markets are great. That's a really good way to get people involved in where their food comes from, to have direct conversations with farmers about their food, about where it's coming from. We like to think of farmers markets as a bit of a gateway drug into the local food system, because they're great, but they're also like a little bit shit, because if you're a farmer, you don't really necessarily want to have to wake up at 5 a.m. every weekend to stand at the farmer's market, hope that it doesn't rain and that people actually come and that you'll actually sell the produce that you've picked, because what do you do at the end of the day with a table full of radishes that nobody bought? But if you can get people engaged in their local food system beyond just, taking their wicker basket to the farmer's market and playing pretend at local food and actually embedding local food into the local system, then that's how we can actually start to create real change and see a food system that's working for the farmers and for the community, so that we'll also get those health outcomes that Walter was speaking about before, So if everybody has better access to local food, then we'll begin to see those health performance increases, lowering the cost of our health system, and all of those things start to become obvious that they're all really connected, and it's not just about food as a silo. It has to be food as a collective. And so collectivizing on all levels is really important. So Southern Harvest exists to collectivize small-scale farmers in our region. And so we collectivize, we aggregate, we distribute, but we also provide a network for farmers to talk to each other, to learn from each other. That horizontal knowledge sharing is so important. But then because we're collectivized with AFSA, we then have networks all over Australia with other small-scale local farmers. So Tammi recently, with a few other AFSA folks, went on the Agroecology Roadshow. So they hopped in the ute and headed all the way up the east coast of Australia. And we were hearing similar stories about farmers who were losing access to their infrastructure, losing access to local markets, who were trying to do the right thing, who really wanted to, be farming regeneratively, to be taking care of the soil, taking care of their animals. But at the end of the day, if you can't actually get any of that produce to market, then it really just de-incentivizes you and makes it impossible for you to make a living. And so now we're able to kind of learn all those lessons from all of those different farmers all the way up and down the coast. We can share the blueprints as well. Like literally, we have the blueprints of Tammy's abattoir that we can share and that we can talk about. So we've been having a little bit of discussion about local abattoirs and what that might look like in our area. We've got the challenges of the Sydney water catchment around the Braidwood area. We've got all of the challenges around legislation. So it's really hard to set up a micro-abattoir. It's really hard to set up a mobile abattoir or any kind of processing because, legislation comes in with a really big top-down approach. So all of the legislation that's coming in around horticulture, leafy greens, berries, and melons likes to consider as if everybody is a big, huge farmer that is only farming one thing. Whereas in Southern Harvest, we know that we've got a lot of really small-scale farmers who might be farming berries and melons and leafy greens on a super small scale. What, do they have to pay 3 times to be registered? Do they have to pay 3 times to have somebody come out and inspect their farm? So being able to advocate as a group, as a collective, to those government organisations when they start talking about consulting with stakeholders, stakeholder engagement, we can be the stakeholders and we can say, hey, there's hundreds of us doing it like this, and your big top-down legislation doesn't actually work for us on this scale because we're much smaller than you want to talk about, but we are still feeding people. So Southern Harvest has got, we feed about 120 households every week through our multi-farm produce box subscription scheme, plus the Bungendore farmers markets, plus the community store at Bungendore, plus the restaurants that we're supplying. And that's just a small part of where our producers are sending their produce. So some of them have their own box schemes, some of them are sending things directly to shops, directly to other restaurants, or they're going to multiple farmers markets in the region to get their stuff to consumers, to directly market to consumers. So there's actually a lot of local food happening, but the barriers that are there are around infrastructure, they're around access, and they're around legislation. And the best way to overcome all of those barriers is to do it collectively, to do it as a group. Because if you're just a farmer doing it alone on your square patch of earth, stopping at the fence line, essentially you're just a doomsday prepper then, right? Like, you've actually got to be part of the system to make it happen.
Yeah, no, and I'll just, with the legislation, I'll make the final point about that scale appropriateness. Like the abattoir, the way abattoirs are defined in the scheme, doesn't matter which state you're in, they're all the same, right? And so the abattoir we were going to, Hardwicks, processes, I think it's 1,000 beef a day, or it's like 4,000 sheep. It's a lot of animals. That abattoir that you saw we're building, we can process up to 6 cattle in a day. So obviously the impact on environment and amenity are pretty different, but the scheme doesn't recognize that. So the reforms that we're asking for are super common sense. They're about acknowledging the difference in the risk profile of the different scale of operation, which is also what Lucy was talking about with the leafy greens, melons, and berries. It's being applied as though everyone has 1,000 hectares of watermelons, which is what cantaloupe, which was one of the outbreaks like a decade ago. As the guy who harvests it in the morning and goes down to the farmer's market, you're not going to kill somebody with salmonella. Like you will or listeria, I think that one was, from a large-scale system. So that's the kind of advocacy that we're doing, is just painting a very clear picture, evidence-based picture. We know that there are still genuine risks in any kind of food production, so we don't try to pretend there's not, but they're very different in a small-scale system without a long supply chain.
There questions? How are we doing for time?
I don't know. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, we can pretty well wrap it up there if you like. There wasn't any specific questions that have come through to you, but what will happen is that all of the questions will be when you're sitting on the panel.
Okay, cool.
So this will be part of that discussion through there.
Right.
What I was thinking of doing though was I might just have a crack at answering a couple of the questions that was put up earlier. But
got a question.
Go ahead, yeah.
Can you please expand on Audrey and how she works and how you...
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so Audrey's amazing. Stuart, when he went looking to see what he could do for a rotating composting drum, because he gets sick of turning compost, we all do. Who doesn't get sick of turning compost? the ones you could find that somebody could build for you were between $150,000 and $250,000 to buy. So like actually more than it's costing us to build an abattoir. So Stuart being Stuart, he found a design from a school in the US, which they subsequently took down, downloaded it before they took it down. And then she's 2 meters diameter, 1.5 meter diameter pipe, and that's 6 meters long. She's on a chain drive run on a solar panel. So she turns the 360 once a day on average. We try to keep that internal temp at 55 for a minimum of 4 days. And so that and it only takes 2 weeks for the material that goes in at this end to come out the other end. So it's mostly boning room waste right now going in, so it's just trim. And then from the abattoir, it'll be the paunches and their contents. We'll be using all the edible offal, but cow hooves, paunches and contents, and then we do 8 to 12 times as much carbon as nitrogen that goes in at a time. So we've also actually invested in a bin lifter for all of this because we're not getting younger, and so bringing those things up to her mouth is getting more challenging, especially when you talk about a cow paunch. That's going to be a challenge. And then at the end, the bones don't all break down by that point, especially beef bones. They're older animals, so they're much harder. So they come through for a second round, but then they can be crushed by the second time through. And they're clean when they come out. They're just not quite soft enough. And then that goes into IBCs and matures for a minimum of 2 months. And the EPA is satisfied that that's a safe product to then be spread out on the paddocks. If you don't get enough carbon in there, it's too nitrogenous for the vegetables. So we're always monitoring that. And it's going out on paddocks when it's too nitrogenous, and then it's going to vegetables when it's the right balance. Yeah, everybody loves Audrey. Stuart describes her as his second love, which is super weird if you haven't met her yet.
Okay, fabulous. So thank you very much.